Hello, I'm Stephen Harriott, and this is the Stephen Harriott Show by Catholic Vote. One thing that's been in the news a lot is Syria and the U.S. airstrikes against Syria last week in response to alleged chemical attacks in the city of Douma. It's hard to follow this stuff, but I've been following it for many years. John Zmirak over at The Stream has already written a great article which analyzes this whole situation by using the just war criteria that are contained in the Catechism. I'm going to do the same thing, but a little bit differently, and I advise you to follow along. Go ahead and don't Google. Never use Google. Google is evil. DuckDuckGo. Just the phrase just war criteria or just war principles and catechism together, and you'll find this stuff. First of all, the catechism makes very clear that it is our duty to avoid war. And the onus is always on the person who is proposing an aggressive act of war. He has to justify that. All citizens and all governments are obliged to work for the avoidance of war. Now, the strict conditions for legitimate defense by military force require rigorous consideration. The gravity of such a decision makes it subject to rigorous conditions at one and the same time. And here are the principles. 1. The damage inflicted by the aggressor on the nation or community of nations must be lasting, grave, and certain. Number 2. All other means of putting an end to it must have been shown to be impractical or ineffective. Number 3. There must be serious prospects of success. Number 4. The use of arms must not produce evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. So let's go through those with regard to Syria. First, is the damage inflicted by the aggressor on the nation or community of nations lasting, grave, and certain? Well, first of all, who is the aggressor? Are we even certain that the Assad regime used poisonous gas against his own people? The real answer is no.
We're looking for the actual evidence.
But even if you don't believe me and Secretary Mattis that we don't know, I'll do you one even better. We never even tried to find out. In 2017, Nikki Haley all but promised not to investigate any future attack on the Syrian people when she stated, any future attack on the Syrian people will be blamed on Assad. In other words, Assad is blamed in advance, and we will not investigate. So it's not certain who used the chemical weapons against the Syrian civilians this year, but one thing is certain. True to Ambassador Nikki Haley's word, we did not investigate before blaming and punishing Assad. Within minutes of the initial reports, not within hours, not within days, within minutes, we were already blaming Assad and threatening consequences. Even though days later, Secretary Mattis admitted that we still did not have evidence that it was Assad, and what's more, we would not have evidence for an indefinite amount of time.
We're trying to get those inspectors in. We will not know from this investigating team. We will not know who did it. 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 They can only say that they found evidence or did not, and as each day goes by, as you know, it's a non-persistent gas, so it becomes more and more difficult to confirm it.
The reason this matters so much is that if our goal is to punish whoever used chemical weapons in Syria this year, then Bashar al-Assad is not the only suspect we have to deal with. As it turns out, the Army of Islam, that's right, the same people on whose word we blamed Assad, that Army of Islam has itself been accused of using chemical weapons against its enemies, the Kurds, in 2016. Before that, after another chemical weapons scandal that brought the West within a brink of trying to topple Assad, a UN investigator testified that it was the rebels and not the Assad regime that had used sarin gas in 2013. So back to the question, is the damage inflicted by the aggressor lasting, grave, and certain? I'll be generous to the war-pushing side here and say, yes, in the event of a chemical attack that is a war crime, that could potentially do lasting, grave, and certain harm to the community of nations that upholds international laws against war crimes. But ultimately, since we don't know who the aggressor is, the question is unanswerable. Pending an investigation by the same international community that, instead of investigating, punished one suspect instead of investigating both, which is itself unjust. Number 2, have all other means of putting an end to it been shown to be impractical or ineffective? Well, if our goal is putting an end to the Syrian civil war altogether, then surely the first priority will be to get rid of the genocidal jihadism that aims to overthrow Syria and turn it into an ethnically cleansed Sharia state. Well, in case you've missed it, in the last year and a half, town after town has been liberated by U.S.-backed forces and the Assad regime.
I kiss your soil, Syria, Fadia cries. We kneel before you, Bashar. Now they feel they owe him everything.
And the Assad regime and U.S.-backed forces have molested each other relatively little. These liberated civilians, by the way, are not all big fans of Assad, but nonetheless tend to prefer to live under the Syrian state rule when the alternative is to live under the jihadist rebels, like the ones who told us in the first place that Assad had used chemical weapons this month. In fact, one town from which you can find footage of Syrian civilians celebrating having been liberated from jihadist rebels is Douma, the very city where the chemical attack that this is all about happened. Here are the civilians apparently patriotically waving the Syrian flag and cheering after Russian and Syrian regime forces liberated them from the rebels in Duma. Keep in mind, these are civilians in the town where the chemical attack was supposed to have just happened, and they are celebrating the person who committed the chemical attack against them. So no, we haven't exhausted all means of putting an end to the conflict. On the contrary, you could argue that over the past year and a half, we've only just begun to discover the best means of putting an end to the conflict, working in tandem with, rather than against, the Assad regime and Russia in liberating innocent civilians from the clutches of jihad. At least for now, that would be a good outcome, don't you think? Number 3, there must be serious prospects of success. And again, I'll be generous to the war-pushing side here and say, yes, we have great prospects of success. In fact, I'll give it an A+. The U.S. is really good at achieving singular military goals. We're a superpower. We're really especially good at toppling regimes. As Nigel Farage said to Tucker Carlson last week,
well, just think about what's happened over the course of the last 15 years or so. Iraq, we went in, we tried to get rid of the Arab nationalist dictator. We succeeded. What was the result? Hundreds of thousands of death and chaos. Libya, the same. We go in, we get rid of an Arab nationalist leader that we don't like, and we open the door for ISIS. Our track record of intervening because morally we think we should, without a proper strategy, without working out a long-term plan, is bad. Can you imagine if the scale of the strikes was such that Assad got toppled? Do we actually think that would make Syria safer and better? You know, whatever we think of Assad and the support that he's had from the Russians, they have just beaten ISIS militarily in the field. So there are some big issues here where we have similar interests.
That's the whole problem. The U.S. is really good at succeeding and destroying Middle Eastern countries' governments, but we leave misery and chaos and even genocide in the wake of our successes. Which brings us to our final criterion. The use of arms must not produce evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. And here's where it all falls abysmally apart. As I just mentioned, in the wake of our successes against governments in the Middle East, there have been horrible consequences for the most endangered people in those regions. Take Iraq, for example. As the Knights of Columbus reported to Secretary of State John Kerry a couple of years ago, since the invasion of Iraq and toppling of Saddam Hussein in 2003, attacks on Christians living in Iraq have increased to the point where 1.4 million Christians there in 2003 has fallen to just 275,000 in 2016. This is why Iraqi Christian Relief Council President Juliana Tamarezi told me in a recent interview, "For me, as a Middle Eastern Christian, it's terrifying to hear that Assad should be attacked or Assad should be removed, because we see what happened when we removed Saddam Hussein. If we remove Assad, Christians will be slaughtered across the region even more, because we don't know what will fill the vacuum when Assad is removed." It's also why a lot, not all, but a lot of Christian Syrian and Syrian expats from Damascus to Pennsylvania have been pleading with the U.S. government under Barack Obama and now continuing under Trump not to ruin Syria. As one Syrian Christian expat in Pennsylvania said last year, Syria is fighting ISIS on its own to the end. Russia is in Syria. Russia isn't stupid either. They know they have the upper hand now. They would not use chemical weapons. And also this is why last week, in response to the U.S. strikes on Syria's regime, the 3 most prominent Christian leaders in Syria condemned the action. This brutal aggression destroys the chances for a peaceful political solution and leads to escalation and more complications, they said. This unjust aggression encourages the terrorist organizations and gives momentum to continue in their terrorism. Talk about producing evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. As for me, I stand with the persecuted church and their condemnation of the strikes against Syria. This isn't the official teaching of the church, it's my interpretation of what's in the Catechism, but I advise you to look up those criteria and listen to the pleas of the most vulnerable people in the Middle East and come to your own conclusion. You know, the saddest thing about all of this, and the thing that worries me the most, is that, as I reported here at Catholic Vote, just before he was elected in 2016, Donald Trump really seemed to get it.
Our current strategy of nation building and regime change is a proven absolute failure. We have created the vacuums that allow terrorism to grow and thrive. Before the Obama-Clinton administration took over, Libya was stable, Syria was under control, Iraq was experiencing a reduction in violence. Fast forward to today. What we have, Libya is in ruins, Syria is in the midst of a disastrous civil war, ISIS controls large portions of territory. President Obama and Hillary Clinton should have never attempted to build a democracy in Libya. to push for immediate regime change in Syria, I also believe that we could find common ground with Russia in the fight against ISIS.
My hope for the Middle East right now is that Donald Trump listens to the catechism, listens to the pleas of the persecuted church in the Middle East, listens to himself, and doesn't listen to Nikki Haley. This is the Stephen Harriott Show, the show that's more intelligent than our intelligence community. I'm your host, Stephen Harriott.